Okay, let's start this one better than we just did. Our first aborted attempt at doing this. We're going to look at the Churchill sources paper. We're going to do a few of them hopefully today, and then we'll start with 2024. So again, just walking through the structure I'll run through for the students, like what you need to do with these. So obviously they give you four sources and they give you a statement. So this time the statement was Churchill was best suited to be Prime Minister in 1940. So first thing you've got to do is highlight very clearly the statement. What are the key words? So best suited and to be prime minister and in 1940 are the key words. And you're only looking for evidence in the source on that and that statement alone. So students often make the mistake of just talking in general about the sources, whether they're accurate or not, but it's only related to the question that's relevant. And you're always going to pull out like one sentence that gives you your evidence, or maybe if you've got a nuanced source that both agrees and disagrees, then you'll have a couple of sentences, but otherwise you just need one. And then you've got your four sources like source A, B, C, and D. And with each source, when you're in the exam, you just quickly read it and put in the margin a Y for yes or N for no, or YN, Y backslash N if it's yes, no, if it agrees and disagrees with the statement. So you're just very quickly working through with a highlighter pen, highlight the key language it tells you, whether it agrees or disagrees, and then and then just mark it yes or no. And then when you finish that, you need to decide the order of the sources. So you have to rank that, you have to talk about them in order from most supportive to least supportive. So once you've got them, obviously you'll look at all the yeses and you'll be like, which one is the most strong? That one's, and I mean, the whether it agrees or disagrees is kind of, you can't really get it wrong because you will lose marks. You're kind of capped at level 4 if you misread a source. But like when you're ranking them, there's a little bit more flexibility for which is strongest. You can justify that. And then obviously after you've done that, you will then write for the first paragraph, just in the introduction, you just have to say basically um sources, which sources agree and which sources disagree with the statement. And that's it, like one line, nothing more. It's a waste of time. They don't even mark the introduction. You don't need one, but it helps you focus on which ones are supportive and which ones aren't. And then when you start writing it, you want the most, and you just said the most supportive source is the next most supportive source, the next most supportive source, and like the basically the least supportive source. And don't get creative with it. So I would say the most, the second most, the next most, and the least supportive. It's kind of the easiest way to do it. And then once you've kind of done it, you've got to obviously one third content, one third context, one third provenance. So the content is like the quote, and why does your quote say that it support? Why does your evidence say that it supports this statement, or why does it not? And then context is you applying your historical knowledge to say, is the source, the content of the source, i.e. the non-bits in bold, is it accurate or not? So you got to really rip it apart by like, how much can we trust this source? Because do they know what they're talking about? And then provenance is reliability. How reliable is it? And that one you're looking at the bold parts. So at the top and the bottom of the source, you have parts in bold. That's basically what you're going to be using for the provenance. So it's like basically what is the purpose of the writer? So from their purpose, like the purpose, you can then say, all right, from that purpose, I can know if the date is important or the person or who they're writing to. Why are they writing in this format? What's the format of it? Why at this point in time? What do they want to gain out of this? And from all of that, you can see whether you would trust them in this point in terms of reliability. And then for each source at the end, you just kind of put a mini conclusion how accurate and reliable it is. So a source can either be accurate and reliable, um, inaccurate and reliable, which is rare because it's weird that someone would be reliable but they don't know what they're talking about. Accurate and unreliable, which is quite possible, and then inaccurate and unreliable. And in your conclusion, you're kind of working out which is the most reliable source, which is the source that is best as a historian, which is the source we should trust, which gives us the best answer to this question. And in your conclusion, you kind of eliminate out the sources that are less reliable, and then you from the most reliable ones, the ones you would choose as a historian if you were researching this topic, what's the answer to the question? And that's kind of a base summary. Does that, Pia, did that sound like a clear explanation of structure?
I think so. I think so.
Right, cool. So let's look at this one. I'm going to do the first one. I'm going to model it, and Peter's just going to add anything to it, and then he'll do the second one, and I'll add stuff to his points. Um, so with source A, the first one, the leading journalist, the diplomatic editor. So it's like, does it agree or disagree? So I'll read it out just in case there's some. There's a drive against Chamberlain. I can't quite see who can advantageously take his place. Curiously enough, what is really needed is that Winston should be made to take a rest. He is overdoing himself and taking the strain by stocking himself up duly with champagne, liqueurs, etc. He dines out almost every night. He has got into the habit of calling conferences and subordinates after 1 a.m. So there is an atmosphere of strain in the admiralty, which is all wrong. Yeah, Winston is such a popular hero that he cannot be dropped, but he ought to be rested. Key thing here is that it obviously disagrees, or I believe it disagrees with the question he was best suited. Because it's saying he's a popular hero, so obviously it's kind of implying that the public think he's really suited to his job. But he's clear in his way of saying he should be made to take a rest and he ought to be rested. Using that twice throughout it suggests that he thinks he should be on the sideline, even though the public believes that he's not. He's obviously not in favor. He also talks about the strain of the Admiralty, which is all wrong. So I think all of the evidence and language, and you have to take from the source. It's not your interpretation. It doesn't matter what you think of something for the content. Content is what the source says and nothing more. You don't make any evaluation of it, just purely what is it saying. And then it's afterwards your context and your provenance you evaluate it. Would you agree, Peter, that the source disagrees with the statement?
I do. I wrote negative next to this
Yeah.
on my piece of paper. But
Mhm.
as you say, I think you made a good point. You do have to read it carefully because you could, for example, if Winston's a popular hero, you could regard that as rather positive.
Mhm.
But yeah, definitely negative.
Yeah, I think the two contrasting, because you've got the yet and then the but. So I think the contrasting
Yeah,
language helps you put it out there.
yeah, indeed.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Source B from a
Can
leading
you can you can you
on
give a bit of a posh English accent to this? I want to hear your,
I'm coughing away.
conservative I want to hear how a conservative MP would actually say that.
A leading member
Yes.
of Pro Churchill group of conservative. Yes, yeah, okay. Uh, can I do a posh British accent? I don't know, maybe you can do one better than me. I have been in the House of Commons all day. This is the situation as I see it. The Labour Party won't have Chamberlain as PM at any price, nor will the Liberals, nor will our group of Tory MPs. A majority of the House is determined on a radical reconstruction. Opinion is hardening against the appointing Halifax as Prime Minister. I find a gathering consensus of opinion in all quarters that you are the necessary and inevitable Prime Minister. As I wrote to you some weeks ago, God knows it is a terrible prospect for you, but I don't see how you can avoid.
That
Uh,
was extremely good, James. I'm very impressed. I didn't know you had it in you.
well, I've hung out with enough of these people at university, so I can copy them. Their posh diction. Um, so yeah, in this one, it's clearly saying that I believe this is clearly obvious that it's saying he's the most suitable for the position. Even though he's saying it's God knows it is a terrible prospect for you, which
Yes.
I
So God knows it is a terrible prospect, but I
yeah
don't see how you can avoid. That sounds
yeah
in some ways rather negative, doesn't it? But I don't
yeah
think it is. I think it's a
no
bit I think it's tongue in cheek.
I don't know actually. I think it just might be kissing his ass, which they usually do with Churchill if he's trying to get on the side. But I don't see how you can avoid. But I think the key line in here is I find a gathering consensus of opinion in all quarters that you are the necessary and inevitable Prime Minister. I think that's pretty
Yeah.
clear.
Yeah. Indeed.
As in like, basically in that's pretty strong. I think he's just buttering him up by basically
But
saying,
I don't see how you can avoid. I mean, is Churchill really wanting to avoid
but
to
that's
be
my
prime
point.
minister?
If
I
he
don't think
doesn't
so.
know Churchill at all. I think Churchill's ambitions throughout the 1930s were quite clear. I don't know how he'd be like, oh, of course you
Indeed.
don't want
That's
Prime Minister.
that's right.
Never seen anything in your character that says you want it.
That's what, but politicians always say, I reluctantly take the
Yeah.
post of,
Yeah.
president. So,
Yeah, and this is when we get onto when we get onto provenance for
so,
reliability and content, like in context of accuracy of the source. That's when we'll get into these things. But that's where students have to be careful. When you're reading it, your opinion is irrelevant in terms of content. It's like whether you agree or like we were talking now, that's more going to be context provenance. It's just literally what do they say? And the clear thing is
yeah.
to find a gathering consensus of opinion will cause you the necessary inevitable provenance.
Do some students make that mistake? Do they start arguing
Yeah, well, they start
that
giving
that
their opinion.
Churchill was a bad prime minister, he shouldn't have been chosen, rather than
Yeah,
what the sources are saying?
or they'll be like, what they're saying is not accurate or whatever. And I'm like, yeah, that's fine, but that's context. And the key is like the moment they start telling me something that's not written in the text, it's not content. And I try and label it like GCSE source questions for like, sorry, poetry comparisons in GCSE English. You have to pull from the source. You can't have an opinion unless you've pulled from the source. And I think that some students inevitably try and go straight at it, like, oh,
Yeah.
it's inaccurate. And I'm like, yeah. Or they'll be like, they'll be like, it disagrees because it's wrong. And I'm like, no, that's your opinion. That's context. Is that content is what they say and only what they say, and that's it. So you're looking for your evidence in the source.
So, James, now's the next challenge for you is to not just do a Conservative MP, but to do Churchill himself.
I'm not sure I can do Churchill. Churchill writes about meeting to himself, Chamberlain, Halifax. I can't even, how does his voice even go? Yeah. Mr. Chamberlain
Mr.
evidently had in his mind the stormy scene in the House of Commons 2
Oh,
weeks
no.
before.
That's terrible,
Yeah,
James.
I'm not going to.
All my praises now. I take it back.
I just don't have it in me to do, probably haven't got that, imperialistic bombast to do Churchill's voice.
Oh, you can always work on it.
You're more of an imperialist than me. Can you do Churchill?
Oh, be quiet. All right, I'll
Um,
read it. I'll read it
yeah,
in my broad Australian accent. This is terrible.
yeah.
Sorry, students.
Mm.
Mr. Chamberlain evidently had in his mind the stormy scene in the House of Commons 2 nights before, when I had seemed to be in such a heated controversy with the Labour Party. Although this had been in his support and defence, he nevertheless felt that it might be an obstacle to my obtaining their adhere at the juncture. I do not recall the actual words he used, but this was the implication. His biographer, Mr. Feeling, states definitely that he preferred Lord Halifax. As I remained silent, a very long pause ensued. Then at length Halifax spoke. He said that he felt his position as a peer would make it very difficult for him to discharge the duties of Prime Minister in a war like this.
Very good. Should have done it in a Churchill accent then.
That was a bad Churchill accent. I was kind of, yeah,
I tried to do it, didn't really
classic.
work. This one I think is clear that this one I think disagrees with the statement that he was the only choice because Churchill himself is saying that Halifax was the choice. So he was not necessarily the inevitable prime minister. I mean, the bit at the end where it's like Halifax felt he couldn't do it is kind of implied, but at no point does he say I'm the choice in this source, which is remarkably
Could it,
unchecked in.
yeah, this is somewhat ambiguous though. Couldn't you argue that this source says that Halifax himself didn't regard himself as a possibility? So by process of elimination, we've got Churchill. So isn't that somewhat positive in
Yeah,
support
but I
of
think by
Churchill?
process of elimination is again you reading your contextual knowledge into it. You can only take the language of the source. At no point does he say I am the person because he said, or like,
No.
he said like basically he'd been in a heated controversy with Labour Party as well. He had people that didn't support him. Might be an obstacle to my obtaining their ad here. So I don't think it was inevitable that he was going to be prime minister from the source.
Mm.
The key
And
words in the
it's
question are best suited to be prime minister, and it's like clearly a number of people feel that he is not necessarily the best suited.
yes.
And if he gets it,
That's
it's kind of, they kind
confusing.
of feel Halifax is the best suit. Halifax doesn't feel that, but it's going to be default, I think, if he gets it. So for me, I think this source is, I think source C leans towards doesn't support the statement. Certainly
I
not,
said I
certainly
said
not
somewhat
clearly.
positive. I said somewhat positive in the
You think
sense
it
that
supports it?
well, it suggests that Halifax, although he was preferred himself, felt that his position as a peer would make it very difficult for him to discharge the duties of Prime Minister in a war like this. So it's a source that suggests that Halifax, despite being preferred,
Yeah,
is regards himself as unqualified for the
yeah.
position.
But you
Or
have to use your own knowledge on that. And the moment you're applying your own knowledge to something, it's not taking content from the source. And that's the danger, and that's why it's like, and like I said, even my student who went to Cambridge, she thought C was supportive, and she thought A was supportive of the source of the statement.
yeah,
Because she went all for support, and I was like, no, they don't. And I was like, I think the fact that they clearly said it felt that might be an obstacle to my obtaining the ad here. Stormy scene, heated controversy with the Labour Party. There's a lot, and again, Chamberlain preferred Halifax, so he was not. Um, the best suited to for everyone. You know what I mean? It's not obviously he was the best suited.
well,
We'll
it's
talk
like,
about how
yeah, we'll talk about it
how
because
accurate it is, but like I think this is Churchill being the least Churchillian he ever is in one of the sources. I think it's one of the few ones where we can trust him a little bit.
Right.
Usually he's, I always said usually Churchill was unreliable, but you never know when you run it. Source D, then a former Conservative cabinet minister resigned in 1938 of Munich gives his view over why Churchill became prime minister. So on 10th of May 1940, the Germans invaded Holland and Belgium. Chamberlain's first reaction was that this terrible event gave him an excuse to remain as prime minister. He was persuaded that the events only meant he should depart urgently. The choice lay between Churchill and Lord Halifax. Churchill's reputation had risen sharply since 1939. He had shown himself a highly competent First Lord of the Admiralty. His speeches in the Commons had been better than any of his colleagues. Halifax remained the foreign minister of Munich. The choice was obvious. I think that this one is clearly supportive of the key line is the choice was obvious. So
Yeah.
it
Duff
means
Cooper.
yeah,
Yeah. And it's important to read the last line too, that
yeah,
in bold, Duff Cooper, old men forget the
yeah,
date 1953.
yeah.
Okay, so
Yeah,
that's
and that's when we
interesting.
get to provenance and reliability, we track these things out. So like when you're looking at I don't even look at the provenance when I'm looking for content because sometimes that can influence because if you look at the parts in bold, your
Yeah.
brain already starts looking at reliability and accuracy and you don't want to be doing that. Because it's just like literally like what's it saying, and then because then I'll look afterwards if it's accurate or not. So then obviously we've got like we agree we have a slight disagreement on C, but I think it's against. But you could go either way. It's certainly the second least supportive source, and that's the
I
key
agree.
in terms of
Yeah.
ranking. So
Yeah.
then you got to rank them most supportive to least supportive. I would go D B C A.
And can I ask why D over B's? Because B's
Because
pretty
he seems,
supportive
because
too.
the only reason I would go D over B, and it's only minor things, but D is like the choice was obvious, so it's clear. At
Yeah,
no point does he say
indeed.
there's any kind of like, hesitation at all. Whereas in source B, he says like, oh, God knows you don't want it. So I think that slightly just dims it, slightly just takes it down a notch.
Yeah, I agree. I think in D it sounds like Duff Cooper makes it sound like Churchill was destined
Yeah,
for the
yeah,
position,
yeah,
and that there was no doubt that
yeah,
Churchill was the man for the job.
yeah,
Whereas in B, I think you get the sense that the source is actually thinking through the possibilities and is kind of
yeah,
by process of elimination
yeah, yeah, yeah,
got to got to Churchill.
yeah.
Um,
Yeah, yeah.
okay,
And I
yeah,
think when
cool.
we
So
get
I
to
agree with
provenance,
that.
we'll see why that's the case as well. It's clearly for a reason. C, we kind of have slight disagreements on whether it agrees or disagrees, but it's clearly not
Somewhat.
as negative as
It,
A. So on
yeah,
the
it's
second,
both less clear than either B or D,
yeah.
right? So we can put it
Oh yeah, for sure.
third.
Yeah, yeah. Because
Yeah,
I
and
mean,
then
I
that
don't even
leaves
think I don't even think it agrees, but it's certainly the third of the four. Yeah,
yeah, and then that leaves source
yeah,
A by process of elimination as the final as
yeah,
the least supportive. It's in
yeah.
negative. That's pretty
Yeah.
obviously negative.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Mhm.
Cool. So then obviously when we decided we would go to D, because D is if a D is our source that we think is the most supportive, we start with D. So then we got to look at accuracy. So we were looking at it, it says like Chamberlain's first reaction was that he should remain as Prime Minister, which is true. The choice lay between Churchill and Lord Halifax, is what he says. That is accurate because we know that they were realistically the only two possible alternatives. That Chamberlain had lost the support. No one believed he was a competent wartime Prime Minister, so he had to go. Um, and then so I think that part of it is accurate, but it's only somewhat accurate, this source, because there's two problems with this source in terms of accuracy. He'd shown himself to be a highly competent First Lord of the Admiralty is inaccurate because he'd had the disastrous Narvik campaign in Norway. And so I don't think he had proved himself to be highly competent. And even when he was at First Admiralty in the First World War, which I know is not really relevant, but he launched Gallipoli. So I don't think him being a highly competent First Lord of the Admiralty is.
We can talk about that. I think Churchill's role in Gallipoli is a bit exaggerated in terms of his
Well, we should focus, I
role in the
suppose it's
disaster.
me,
But
yeah, it's me
anyway,
going up, well, as an
so
Australian, you can,
I don't know. I'm a complete traitor to
as
my
your
country. I
fellow
know the
people
Australians love
who
to jump
died.
on Churchill for that.
Yeah, well, Narvik
So,
campaign. We should really focus on Narvik campaign. That's me going
yeah,
to Gallipoli, but
sure.
it's like relevantly to the source. It should be Narvik. Narvik was a strategic failure, or like at least at that period of time, most people saw it as a failure.
Yeah.
So I don't think he's a highly competent First Lord of the Admiralty.
But hang on, does the fact that the campaign was a failure, does that necessarily mean that
Do you want to make
Churchill?
a defense of him as a highly competent First Lord of the Admiralty?
No, not necessarily, but I think just because a campaign fails, it can fail for a number of reasons. It
Do
doesn't
you think
necessarily mean
that is
incompetent.
completely accurate that he'd shown himself to be a highly competent first of all, the Admiralty?
I think it's suspicious. I think we'd
Yeah.
have to check it.
Yeah. I don't
And
see, yeah.
it does suggest that there's some
Yeah.
bias, I think, in the source.
Yeah. And his speeches in the Commons have
You
been
could
better
be
than
correct.
and that's when we'll look at provenance. But like we're looking at just accuracy first on what he said. His speeches in the Commons
Yeah,
have been better than any of his colleagues. I don't think that's the case before he becomes prime minister. I think this is the case of him writing in 1953 and writing with not being clear on the order of things. Because Churchill's most famous speeches were when he was prime minister, not before. His speeches had
yeah,
often been booed on appeasement and rearmament and other stuff. Like, he wasn't
yeah,
considered. His greatest speeches weren't before that. And I think this is the danger of hindsight. He's reliving the history back through the source because it's written afterwards.
yeah. Like a teleological view of history that
Yeah.
you read back from the conclusion.
Yeah.
Um,
Do you
so
agree? I think there's some inaccuracies in
y-
this and with those, because we've got to judge how accurate it is in content. I think it's accurate about it being between Churchill and Halifax and that Chamberlain didn't have the support. But I think the case for why Churchill should get it, I think that's written with hindsight after winning the war.
yeah. So this is the one when you're looking at accuracy, that's where you really need your general knowledge, right? You
Yeah,
really
yeah,
need
that's
to
where
have
you have to
read
be. That's
you
when
really need to have read the chapter
yeah, yeah. So
in order to know this. So
yeah, it's context and provenance are where you're going to be bringing in your general knowledge, where you need to know about the source and you need to know the stuff. So like, because that's why students start doing it from the beginning. You don't. Content is just what they say, and then you pull it apart afterwards. Because
yeah,
look, you're doing the content to rank which one agrees the most to the least, and then the context and provenance are like, yeah, that's fine. It's the most supportive, but is it a good source? Basically, like, do we trust the
yeah.
source or do we eliminate it?
You really do need a method to go through, a method like you outlined, because if you
Yeah,
just try to do it all at once, it's going to
yeah,
end up super confused, I think. I think you
yeah.
have to be able to separate each of those domains, right? The
Yeah, yeah.
provenance or the
I think so. It's just a
accuracy
process, and
and
you just drill that process till the students master it. And then it becomes automatic, and the exam becomes easier. My students usually get good grades on this one. And then
yeah,
if we're looking at provenance of this source, I would say it's
yeah,
unreliable because it's a
yeah,
cabinet minister, Duff Cooper. He's a Tory MP. I think he's still actively campaigning, and Churchill is prime minister in 53. So
yeah,
therefore, he's writing a book. So it's after the war. So we're writing with hindsight. You know that Churchill won it, so his leadership's going to be in. He's
yeah,
reliant on Churchill for his job because he's a Conservative MP in 53,
yeah.
while Churchill was currently Prime Minister again. And he resigned in 1938 over Munich. So he's clearly on Churchill's side and not on Chamberlain's side. So I do not believe, none of these things suggest to me. The purpose of it is clearly to, an old men forget is also like the implication that, oh, yeah, we remember that Churchill's a war hero. I mean, the purpose of this book is clearly to, I imagine, somewhat glorify Churchill for his own position inside the Conservative Party as well. I mean, and I think the fact that it's written after the war and with hindsight is why it's kind of confused the order of events, which makes this, I think, not a very reliable source.
Okay.
Do you have any?
Is there some room for debate
Yeah, go
with that
on.
one? I
Yeah,
mean,
yeah, of
no,
course.
I'm not going to contradict you. I
Yeah,
just, I mean, you know, it could be very positive and in some cases be right or vice versa. I
yeah, but I
mean,
think the fact that
but
it's partially
it's
inaccurate and it's just
but
whether
it is partial. Yeah, it's partial.
reliability is what's their purpose? Would you trust them? Would you
Sure.
trust a Tory MP writing a book in
Yeah.
1953 while Churchill was his
No.
prime minister to be completely impartial about Churchill's suitability
No,
to be
no, no.
prime minister in
No.
1940? Yeah.
No.
And that's it. It's not like it's useless.
Yeah.
It's basically whether it's what limitations or strength, like is this the most reliable source to answer that question? The answer is clearly no.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, and because you're
That's
looking for like you're looking for the most reliable sources. As a historian, you wouldn't take that as your best answer to whether that question was accurate about whether he was best suited to be prime minister in 1940.
agreed.
Yeah, then
Agreed.
we can go to
Okay.
B, and so
Yeah.
so we can say that source is somewhat accurate and pretty unreliable. So therefore, in general, it's not going to be the one you're going to choose to use to answer the question, your conclusion. Then you would move to source B. So again, if you're looking at source B, Situation six, Labour Party won't have Chamberlain as Prime Minister at any price. That's true. They wanted Labour and under Attlee wanted Churchill as Prime Minister, so that's clear. Nor will the Liberals, nor will our group of Tory MPs. That's also true because there was obviously, he's part of a pro-Churchill group, and that group clearly wanted Churchill to be Prime Minister. Opinion is hardening against appointing Halifax. I think that is somewhat true but I think Halifax himself realized he wasn't qualified for the job, as you can see from source C.
Yeah,
You can make the
yeah,
links between them. So I think that's somewhat accurate as well. Gathering consensus of opinions that you are the necessary, inevitable Prime Minister. There was still resistance at this point because Chamberlain was not really in favor, and nor was the King, and nor was some of the Conservative MPs. But I would say that there was a gathering consensus of opinion. I think it was moving in that direction. So I would
yeah.
say this is fairly accurate, but downplaying the resistance to Churchill being Prime Minister because he's a pro-Churchill MP riding. But it's not, most of it is fairly accurate in this one.
Yeah, and wouldn't you add that the date it's being written at the time
Oh yeah, that's
as
why we'll
it's
go to
happening?
provenance. So first to deal with
Oh,
that.
okay.
Yes, yeah. Oh yeah, I would
But
because that's where I would
would
deal with
you
the date. Accuracy
would
is just
you
content. What they're saying, is it accurate or not? But yeah, you can bring in the date through
Oh,
content.
okay. Yeah, sorry. I thought we moved
No,
on to
you can.
provenance.
You can
Okay.
you can say, yeah, it's written at the time, but they knew it. So, I mean, obviously, if looking at provenance, it's a letter written to Churchill. So he's obviously going to tell him what he wants to hear because he's anticipating that Churchill's going to become Prime Minister in one day.
Yeah.
He's a leading member of pro-Churchill Conservatives. I mentioned Sir Robert Boothby is looking for a position in the cabinet, if possible.
Yeah.
So that would be his purpose. So he's clearly writing with the influence of getting a cabinet position, possibly, or at least knowing which way the wind is blowing to make sure he's got some kind of position in Churchill's group. One good thing, though, it's a letter written on the 9th of May, so it's the day before Churchill becomes Prime Minister. So he, they, it's written with knowledge of the time of what's going on. He would know what was happening in the House of Commons. That's why he's pretty accurate there. But he probably wouldn't have known about the closed behind doors discussions with Chamberlain, Halifax, and Churchill, which is why those parts are probably not in his source.
Yeah, that's an excellent point.
Yeah, he wouldn't have known that. So therefore, it's accurate in terms of what he would know. Um, I would say it's somewhat reliable because although he clearly has that intention of like,
So
wanting to butter up Churchill, I still think that, the fact that it's accurate from what his perspective would have been is pretty useful.
are we talking about provenance now?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. Just
Mm,
just to be clear. Yeah.
mm,
Yeah, indeed. And I think the fact that this member of the group of conservatives, so obviously the fact that he's a pro-Churchill group of conservatives
mm.
might lessen his objectivity to some
Yeah,
extent.
for
But
sure.
on the other hand, as you say, it's a personal note.
Yeah,
And there's some doubt. I mean, it's not that this fellow has a full understanding of what's going on.
yeah,
It's not written, unlike Source D, which is a kind of book to be published.
yeah.
Um, it's not making events look as if they were predetermined or,
No.
destined. So I find that in favor of, I think Source
Yeah, and
B
it,
is
it
quite
is
good.
only written for Churchill to read, so it's not written for publication. So, he's giving his genuine opinions, albeit with
He's
the angle of trying to
genuinely
get it.
trying to, yeah, he's genuinely trying to work out the situation here, I
Yeah.
think.
I think he's
Yeah,
angling for a job as well. So,
yeah,
outside,
possibly.
because you butter up Churchill, it's like Trump, but not at the same level. You butter him up, you're going to get more chance of getting a job. Although actually, no, that's a bit unfair because Churchill did usually appoint. Churchill was quite good at appointing people who were he was very good at choosing people for roles.
Mm.
Putting Attlee in charge of the country during the war was domestic front was pretty good, and his appointments in his administration as Prime Minister in 51. He was very good at, he was very good at picking people who were very qualified for the roles he put them in, I think, to give him fairness. So I think, so B, I would say is pretty accurate from what you can, or at least, yeah, pretty reasonably
So
accurate.
just quickly, just a question. What
Yeah.
are the terms of accuracy? What are the levels of accuracy we're dealing with?
Um,
Are we trying to rank them sort of from
yeah,
very accurate, accurate,
yeah, yeah.
inaccurate, and very inaccurate?
Your objective
Would that
is you
help?
want to find which source do you think is the most accurate, most reliable, and that's going to be
Okay.
your lead-in source. So you're kind of just trying,
So
and you're trying to eliminate anyone. So as a historian, you would be like, well, it's useful, but would I really trust this to give me an objective answer on whether he was the best suited prime minister, for the job?
Got you. Yeah.
That makes
Okay.
sense. And then source C, you've got Churchill writing about meeting between himself, obviously. So in this one, in terms of accuracy, he'd heated controversy with the Labour Party. Uh, that's kind of interesting because he's saying that himself, although Labour did want him as Prime Minister, so I don't think it was massively effective. Probably was with Bevan, most likely, I imagine. Um, so he's saying that Chamberlain, according to his biographer, preferred Lord Halifax. That's true. Chamberlain, as we know from the earlier sources, and like we've said before, um, definitely Chamberlain and the King preferred Lord Halifax.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
it's definitely true that it was between the two of them.
Yeah.
Where it's slightly inaccurate, I think, is that, and I think this is historical slander that's come through, is where he says that Chamberlain thought that his position as a peer would make him difficult to discharge his duties. And it's kind of become this legend that he didn't want to give up his peerage. My understanding is Halifax understood he wasn't good enough to be Prime Minister. He wasn't the right man for the job, like, but on ability. That Halifax, I think, felt himself to be a good, like, number two, but not a good leader. And that he basically understood that Churchill was the better man for the job at that time. So I don't know if Churchill is somewhat rewriting history a tiny bit because he's writing after the war to kind of undercut his rival, even though he became Prime Minister, and to make Halifax look a bit more like Halifax and Chamberlain look a bit worse than they were. But in general, for Churchill, this is a pretty accurate account, I think.
I
So
disagree with that, by the way. I
what?
think that I think that Churchill, well, number one, I don't see why Churchill, this is in The Gathering Storm, so this is in
Yeah,
1948,
yeah,
right? Churchill's history of the Second World War.
yeah,
I mean, all of this is done. I don't see why Churchill would be, you know, have the necessity, under the necessity um, to be overly negative about Halifax or to exaggerate
mm,
um, Halifax's lack of qualifications for the position. I read it in the opposite way. I thought that Churchill was being somewhat magnanimous. He was saying that Halifax, it's Halifax's position as a peer, not the fact that Halifax thought that he himself wasn't
yeah,
up to scratch, so to speak,
yeah.
right?
The saving face for
It's
Halifax.
a saving. It seems like a somewhat look. Its accuracy is doubtful.
Yeah,
I think it's true that Halifax just couldn't quite. I don't think he could cope with the pressure of being in that
yeah.
position
But I
at
think he
that
knew
time.
that, which is quite a good. Most
It
politicians don't have
is,
that sense of self-awareness,
yeah,
which is quite
yeah.
good.
It's actually remarkable. I
Yeah,
think that
mm,
that happened.
yeah,
And I think that Churchill is maybe actually uh, what's the word? Treating him rather
allowing him to
magnanimously,
save face.
allowing him to save face somewhat by suggesting that
Yeah,
it was an awkward position for him to be in as peer.
yeah,
It's not a personal thing.
yeah.
Anyway,
Maybe.
be that as it may.
Yeah, it could be. It was probably a good idea as well because Halifax was in favor of negotiating surrender with Mussolini, wasn't he? And then
Indeed.
it actually
Yeah.
talked out. So if he had been Prime Minister, the war would have gone very differently. And then in terms of reliability, so obviously Churchill writing a book for publication, 48. So he's out of power. He's looking to become Prime Minister again 3 years later in 51. So he's obviously looking to reassert his reputation because he wants to come back in as Prime Minister. But I think given that it's a book, given it's a publication, I think it's still fairly self-reflective and actually reasonably, you know what I mean? I think it's not actually
Yeah.
a bad source, I think, in terms of
I
like,
mean, couldn't you object and say that Churchill's reasons he gives for the reason he gives for Halifax not stepping up
yeah,
to the prime ministership
yeah.
is inaccurate. It's not
Yeah, that's
essentially because he's
accuracy,
a
but in
peer.
terms of reliability, provenance, what's the purpose? Because normally a book written after the event, you would be like, well, can you trust it?
Yeah,
Not really. But
sure.
I don't feel like Churchill is rewriting his history, in the same way that the other book
Well,
is.
not in this paragraph anyway,
Yeah, yeah,
since the
well, yeah, that
paragraph
is
is what
true.
we've got.
Yeah,
So
for the bit we've got here in terms of doing it. I mean, obviously from a book, you have to be a little bit skeptical because it's written after the time. They know what happens, they know where it went. So you're writing with hindsight, how much they remember. Um, But and maybe that's why. Maybe you're right. Maybe that element of protecting Halifax's reputation comes from the fact that it's a book after the war. He doesn't need to fight these battles again
Yeah.
outside. But I would say this one's all right as a source. Like, and it's unusual for a Churchill source. It's usually he's unreliable.
Okay,
And then
that leaves us
source
with
A.
A.
Yeah. So in terms of accuracy, the fact there's a drive against Chamberlain, that was accurate. That he was a popular hero. I think the public was very much behind Churchill becoming prime minister because he'd accurately called out, to his credit,
Mm.
Hitler's rise to power, the threat of Nazi Germany, the need to rearm, and against appeasement. So he'd been right on all of he'd been wrong on decolonization in India and the abdication crisis, but he'd been very right in seeing what was going to come with Hitler, and what was going to be the threat to Europe.
It's interesting that Churchill he took up such unpopular positions for quite a long period of time. He was in the
Yeah,
political wilderness,
yeah.
and then as the situation changed, he was suddenly on the right side.
Yeah, it's a lesson for
So
politicians
it's
to
a
have more.
it's a lesson, isn't it? It's a
Yeah,
lesson for the sorts of politicians that decide their policies based on the latest polls.
yeah,
That actually, you know, even from the most cynical perspective of political survival, this might
yeah.
not be the best strategy
Yeah, yeah,
in certain cases.
yeah,
Okay,
yeah,
anyway, that's yeah. So
yeah. This,
in terms of accuracy,
yeah. He's
some
talking about the strains at the
yeah,
Admiralty, which contradicts that he was an amazing Lord of the Admiralty. The source D says, and it's like that
yeah,
would be it's what the Times is going to be running it through. He ought to be arrested. This is kind of a personal opinion,
yeah,
and if you look at it, it's like I think it's reasonably accurate, but doesn't really have much of an insight into whether he's suited to be prime minister from a general perspective, and that's probably because he's a journalist. So he
yeah,
wouldn't know, he wouldn't necessarily be able to make that call on suitability for the role of prime minister. He wouldn't have access to those kind of discussions. He wouldn't know what was happening there. It's a diary, obviously written 6 days before Churchill becomes prime minister. So it's obviously going to be it's a diary. So he's actually being accurately going to be recording his opinions. It's not made for publication. This is going to be his genuine take. But at the end of the day, he's a leading journalist for the Times. He's not going to be privy to the conversations that the other members are and say like source B or C, who are
yeah.
more aware of what's going on at the political level and whether Churchill is best suited.
So hang on. So when we talk about accuracy, are we just looking for 2 or 3 points? What's the
Yeah,
most
yeah,
efficient
just
way?
the
So
core points.
how do we reduce? Because there's a lot of information here, right? And there's not a lot of time in this exam.
Well, if it's mostly
So
you pick out anything related to the question, so that's the sentence you picked out to be best suited to be prime minister, you're going to need to deal with that. And then you would look for general inaccuracies in the source, because if there's anything that's inaccurate that's quite significant, then you want to deal with it. And then you've also got to look at in terms of accuracy, what would they know? And that's provenance as well. So it can be yeah, it's accurate, it's a diary, they're going to record their own opinions. Yeah, I don't think they're trying to lie, but what would be, as a journalist of the Times newspaper, what's going to be their access to this? How useful is this source, basically? What kind of knowledge would they have based on it? Not a lot. I would have thought from the insides of the political machine.
yeah, okay.
So I think that one's accurate as far as you can do for the
It's
journalist. So it's accurate in
it
what it's talking
yeah.
about, but doesn't really answer the question that much.
It
Uh,
just shows you how carefully you need to read it. It's not that you have to read,
yeah,
it's not that it's complicated. It's just you have to read what it's actually saying.
yeah,
Because if you just read it really quickly, you'd say, okay, he's a journalist, therefore it's a newspaper article, and
yeah,
therefore it's unreliable.
yeah,
But actually, it's a journalist who's writing a diary at
yeah,
the time in 1940.
yeah,
So if you forget to read that last line that it's a
yeah,
diary,
yeah.
that's actually going to change your answer quite
Yeah,
significantly,
yeah,
I
but
think.
that's why, like I say, so accuracy is the non-bold parts. That's the content of the text. So content is what they say. Context is the non-bold parts, whether it's accurate or not, and provenance is the two parts in bold, whether that makes it reliable or not. So as long as they
Mm,
break, like I said, it's just a process. Once they drill this process down, it becomes incredibly easy to do. But it's just breaking down the parts and making sure they put everything in the right places in the exam is quite important.
indeed.
Which source are you
Okay.
saying are most reliable? In your opinion, which are the
Can I
most
guess?
accurate and reliable sources?
I'd probably say B.
Yeah, I'd say B and C actually. Really B and C combined. I would strike out A because the person doesn't have much knowledge and is clearly intending to slander Churchill outside in his diary. He doesn't like him. And D is written so far after the event, and the inaccuracy in the source makes it less reliable. So you can get rid of D
Well,
and A.
C is written after the event too. It's 1948.
It is, but it's by Churchill himself, so therefore he